US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
America is experiencing its worst agricultural crisis since the Dust Bowl. Farmers who once fed the world are now facing the catastrophic consequences of Donald Trump's trade war. Tariffs that were supposed to bring back jobs have instead become deadly for farms across the country. Once a leader in corn, soybean, and pork production, the US now finds its exports under threat. China, which was one of the largest buyers of American agricultural goods, is no longer purchasing billions of tons of products, all because of decisions made at the highest levels. But that's not all.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Prices for corn, soybeans, and pork have plummeted to four-year lows, and farmers left without markets are now literally drowning in excess production. In some states, farmers are losing their farms at a record pace, unable to withstand the economic pressure. Bankruptcies are up 55% year on year, and farmers are trying to survive by resorting to agritourism and Airbnb. But the question is, will this be enough to save the industry, or is America facing a real agricultural apocalypse?
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
China, for its part, has long since found a replacement for American soybeans in Brazil and Argentina, and a return to these markets in the near future looks highly unlikely. The situation is worsening not only because of tariffs, but also due to climate change. Long droughts, heavy rains, and hurricanes are all pushing us agriculture further to the brink. What will happen if America cannot restore its agricultural power? How will this affect food security around the world? After all, other countries have already begun to impose export bans. India, one of the largest grain producers, has restricted supplies, adding another layer of tension to an already unstable global economy. Against this backdrop, political debates about who is to blame for the current situation are only heating up.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
What awaits farmers whose farms have been destroyed by economic warfare? Can the US restore its status as a food giant? Or are we facing an unprecedented collapse of the entire agricultural system, leading to a global food catastrophe? In this video, we reveal all the secrets and consequences of the largest agricultural crisis in US history, which could affect each and every one of us.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
America, once a global agricultural giant, has been going through the most difficult times in its history in recent years. We are used to hearing about a strong and prosperous farming industry that feeds not only Americans but also many other countries. However, in recent years, farmers, faced with a ruthless trade war, can no longer look to the future with pride. Tariffs signed in 2018, which were supposed to bring back jobs and reduce the trade deficit, have instead been a disaster for us agriculture. It all started when President Trump decided to impose new tariffs on Chinese products. In response, China imposed countermeasures and declared war on American farmers. Corn, soybeans, and pork, which were previously exported to China, are now under threat. American farmers began to lose their major customers, and all these losses hit the economy of the entire country.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
But it was not only Trump, but also the international trade crisis that became the catalyst for what can be called the biggest agricultural collapse in US history. Farmers who were used to working with huge volumes found themselves blocked on all sides. China, which had been the main buyer of American soybeans, now switched to imports from Brazil and Argentina. As a result, farmers found themselves trapped. Corn and soybean prices began to fall rapidly, reaching 4-year lows. The expected growth did not materialize, and farmers began to face a surplus of products that could not find buyers. Problems with sales markets led to US farms being on the verge of bankruptcy. Many farmers across the country saw their farmland lose value and their incomes decline year after year. According to statistics, the number of farm bankruptcies rose by 55% compared to the previous year. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that government support could not cover all the losses, and farmers were forced to look for additional ways to survive. Agritourism and using Airbnb to rent out their farmhouses to tourists became the last resort for many of them. It seemed like a temporary reprieve, but farmers understood that their situation was critical. They could no longer count on the same profits from growing crops, and now every new step was fraught with the danger of bankruptcy.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
But Trump's trade war was not the only problem farmers faced. The impact of climate change also played a role. Against a backdrop of unusually dry years and severe flooding, farmers began to face new challenges. The damage was enormous, as U.S. agriculture was accustomed to stability and predictability, and such climatic extremes changed the whole picture. Not only were the markets closed, but the weather was also unfavorable. Severe frosts, which destroyed crops in some parts of the country, further exacerbated the already difficult situation for farmers.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
The economic consequences of the trade war became even more palpable when farmers began to realize that trade relations with China were unlikely to be restored in the coming years. China had already established new soybean supplies from Brazil and Argentina, and it was extremely difficult for American farmers to regain these markets. The introduction of additional tariffs, although intended to protect American interests, only led to a reduction in exports and the closure of markets for American agricultural products. The external economic situation became increasingly tense, and farmers began to realize that they were left alone with problems that could not be solved overnight.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
When the US escalated trade tensions with China in 2019, farmers faced the real threat of seeing their businesses destroyed. Farmers across the country began to reduce production, which affected harvest volumes. In 2020, the situation became even more desperate, as none of the major markets recovered and export deals failed to return to previous levels. Economists predicted that if the trade war continued, American agriculture could face even greater problems, and it was possible that the US would no longer be able to regain its leading position in global agricultural markets. And now, in 2021, we are seeing the result. Farmers who were accustomed to stable incomes and good prices for their products are now in a deep economic crisis. Their businesses are collapsing, and despite all their efforts, they are unable to rebuild what has been destroyed. Many farms were on the verge of complete destruction. It was the largest agricultural collapse in US history, and few believed that recovery was possible.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
However, despite these dire consequences, there was another side to the coin. Against the backdrop of the deepening crisis, the prospect of new trade agreements with other countries emerged. In particular, the US government began actively seeking new export partners, including through a so-called rethinking of relations with European countries. But there were problems. The European Union, in response to US interference in its internal trade affairs, was unlikely to offer anything that would satisfy American farmers. All attempts to establish new trade flows with Canada and Mexico, although encouraging, were unable to replace the loss of the Chinese market in practice. The weather, as expected, also played a role. In 2020, the weather in the US Midwest began to deteriorate, and farmers faced an abnormally hot summer, which led to lower yields. Droughts, heavy rains, and sudden temperature changes became an integral part of farmers' lives, adding to the anxiety in the agricultural sector. The arid areas previously used for growing corn and soybeans were threatened with complete destruction, as it became impossible to grow these crops in such conditions. What was frightening was that farmers, unable to cope with the situation, were often forced to sell their land or lease it to larger agribusinesses. Meanwhile, the global food situation continued to deteriorate. While the US was the largest grain producer, the situation with exports began to falter. Countries such as India and Russia imposed bans on grain exports, which only exacerbated global tensions. India, one of the largest exporters of rice and wheat, closed its markets to international buyers, citing domestic needs and droughts. This added fuel to the fire, creating shortages in global food markets. Many countries began to watch developments in the US with concern as global food security was threatened. The question was not only how much food would be available, but also what prices would be paid for grain and other basic commodities. Problems with trading partners and climatic conditions were exacerbated by economic problems within the US. Over the past 2 years, farmers have begun to actively reduce their investments in new equipment and technology, which will only worsen the situation in the long run. They could no longer afford to buy new tractors or modernize their warehouses and were forced to choose between loans, which were becoming more expensive every year, in bankruptcy. Lending institutions, in turn, tightened lending conditions, and many farmers found themselves on the verge of financial ruin. Undoubtedly, the crisis caused by trade wars continued to gather momentum, but how long could America tolerate such losses? With each new season, as farmers across the country faced droughts, floods, and sharp price fluctuations, the situation only got worse. And now the main threat to the US was not only the loss of the market, but also the fact that the long-term consequences of this economic war would be felt for many years to come. Global food security was under threat, and the US, as the largest producer of agricultural products, could not stand aside. Over the past few years, the situation on global markets has changed dramatically, and while America used to be the main source of food for many countries, its role has now greatly diminished. Exports of American corn, soybeans, and pork were absolutely critical for countries that depended on these supplies. However, with the introduction of tariffs by Donald Trump, the situation changed dramatically. China began to look for alternative suppliers, and other countries, such as India, restricted their grain supplies to the world market. The US, finding itself on the sidelines, could no longer proudly boast of its status as a food giant, and the world began to feel the consequences. These events not only undermined the US economy, but also threatened the stability of the global food supply. Prolonged droughts and climate change exacerbated crop problems in countries such as India and Brazil. While the US tried to repair its trade relations, the worsening climate only added to the tension. In particular, South American countries such as Argentina and Brazil, which had become active competitors to the US in the soybean market, also began to experience natural disasters that negatively affected their production. Droughts that affected large agricultural regions also hampered normal production of agricultural goods, and in this context, where the US could have become the main supplier if not for the political situation. Economists' forecasts were dire. Many countries, including India, had already imposed bans on rice and wheat exports, leading to higher food prices. At the same time, fears of possible food shortages began to grow in Europe, and questions were increasingly being asked about whether European countries would be able to compensate for the shortage of agricultural products. Many developing countries began to tighten their domestic policies on food exports in order to preserve their own reserves. All this created a complex and unstable situation on world markets, where prices for basic foodstuffs rose rapidly. Thus, the US, which just a few years ago was one of the world's main food suppliers, now found itself among the countries forced to seek solutions amid growing global food instability. Meanwhile, the consequences of the crisis were not limited to the economy. It caused social tensions. In the US, farmers became increasingly disillusioned with government measures, believing that they were incapable of preventing disaster. Federal aid, which was provided in the form of subsidies and tax breaks, only delayed the inevitable. While large farming corporations continued to receive support, small farmers found themselves on the brink of survival. As a result, the number of farms, especially microfarms, continued to decline rapidly. Large farming corporations increased their assets by absorbing small businesses and creating agricultural holdings that controlled virtually the entire market. At the same time, these market changes hurt farmers, especially in small and medium-sized states. Local farmers started to form cooperatives to keep corporations in check and get their products to local markets. However, even these cooperatives faced a shortage of resources as lending conditions became too strict. Lending institutions supporting large corporations refused to grant loans to small farms, making it impossible for them to expand and develop. But the consequences of the crisis were not limited to economic and social aspects. The division among farmers themselves had a serious impact on the situation. In recent years, there has been a clear trend. More and more microfarms are disappearing, giving way to large enterprises. The reason lies in unfair competition, which was caused not only by market conditions but also by US economic policy. Conditions have become virtually impossible for small farmers. High tariffs, deteriorating weather conditions, and restrictions on access to markets have put them in an extremely difficult situation. They were the first to suffer from trade wars, as they could not compete with giants that were granted tax breaks and financial incentives. The reality is that this divide between large agricultural holdings and small farms continues to grow. Small farmers not only lost their land and production, but also faced even greater financial pressure, making their lives almost impossible. At the same time, large agribusinesses received most of the government funding and assistance, which only increased economic inequality in the agricultural sector. As a result of all these processes, the problem of US farmers has become an important element of global food security. The problems faced by farmers in the US are becoming problems for the whole world, and without solving them, America could become one of the main sources of global food instability. Countries that previously depended on American supplies are now facing food shortages and rising prices, which only exacerbates global problems. Thus, the future of American agriculture is directly linked to global economic and political processes,